Humans might have the only minds in the universe that can understand fossils. It's a knowledge that connects us to every other living thing, and none of them can grasp the idea. My guest today is Steve Brusatte. He is a paleontologist at the University of Edinburgh who studies the evolution of dinosaurs and mammals. In his latest book, The Rise and Reign of the Mammals, most chapters begin with a semi-fictional story of a fossil critter navigating an archaic landscape. It's a chronicle of competition, skeletal changes, disaster species, and new life. We spoke in January 2024.
If you were going to be the guy to show fossils to visiting aliens, which fossils would you show them first?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, if some aliens came down, they might be more weird and wacky than any fossils that we know of. I mean, who knows? There could be some aliens out there that look like dinosaurs, and if you showed them a T-Rex, they might be like, yeah, we're used to that. But no, I think I would go for something like, a T-Rex or a Brontosaurus. I mean, those are the ones that, for me, just evoke the most awe and majesty and get my mind racing. They're the ones that are just, to me, the most sublime, the ones that are most unusual, that are so weird compared to anything alive today that we know of. In a way, they're kind of the most alien, dinosaurs. I would try to show those to anybody. And you do occasionally meet people that they don't know much about dinosaurs. They didn't read about dinosaurs as a kid. And they have, very basic questions. And when I come across people like that, I'll usually start with T-Rex by saying, this is what T-Rex is, give them vital stats and try to rope them in that way.
Where does your mind go when you're chipping away at layers of rock looking for fossils? Are there any digging animals that you feel a kinship with?
I guess one of the first, I try to be present enough that I'm not hitting my hand inadvertently with the hammer or something. So, first is you find your spot and, you get down to it. And so I should say even before then, when we start off doing field work, if we go to a new area or even an area we've been to before, we're probably going to start out by prospecting, just by walking around, covering a lot of distance, just getting a broad survey of the rocks, see is there anything interesting sticking out of any of the rocks. And if we see something of a different color, a different texture, something that has a shape, a biological shape to it, then we'll stop, we'll look at it further, we'll get our little tools out. And at that point is really when we would start digging. And so, you really kind of try to establish a perimeter right away. Actually, kind of, what do I have? Can I tell, is this a bone? Okay, how big of a bone is it? Can I tell what bone it is? If it's a thigh bone versus a shoulder blade, they're going to have different shapes. They maybe go into the rock a different way. So that kind of helps you get a picture. You're trying to picture what's inside of the rock, really, which is, of course, impossible, but you're trying to use whatever knowledge you have to almost act like an X-ray machine and predict. And so, in that way, I guess I almost kind of feel like some animals that burrow and move underground, through echolocation, this kind of sixth sense, that we're maybe a bit more like that, that we're trying, although we don't have a formal sixth sense, the more experience you are with fossils, the more you kind of just have an instinct. And so that it would be that kind of animal. I mean, we're not going to be like a dog that's just frantically, ripping apart at the rock because smells something interesting down there. So we try to be a bit more precise and use that sixth sense, if that makes any sense.
You mentioned that the oceanic dispersal of primates to South America was an unlikely event. How would you characterize the rafts that they ended up on? And do you think that was a random accident, or was hopping on rafts a regular strategy?
Good question. I mean, I think so. What we know a couple of things. First of all, I mean, there's these primates that live in South America. They had to get there somewhere, and their DNA shows quite clearly that they evolved from African ancestors, and they evolved at a time where there was no land connection. I mean, South America was an island continent on its own, kind of like Australia, until just 2.5 million years ago. So they definitely came over before then. They had to somehow reach this giant island from Africa. And really the only way that makes any sense is that they somehow sailed across the ocean. Africa was also isolated for a lot of that time. And so you had essentially two island continents, and could they have maybe gone overland somehow, hitched a ride to Asia through Europe and North America and down? That's an even more unlikely thing because we have no fossils of any of those ancestors, and that would require several jumps across water. So it's really quite clear that something unusual happened where these animals went from Africa to South America. The second thing that we know or that we can observe is that this happens with modern animals sometimes, not so much such extreme crossings of large bodies of water, but we do often see after storms that these rafts of vegetation, of floating logs, of down trees, that these things have animals on them sometimes and they can drift far out into the water. And I think, when we say the word raft, I think what comes to mind is like a shipwreck, that some person clings on to, some bit of wood from the ship, and they're on this tiny little thing in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, this little speck in the middle of a raging, angry sea. But these kind of rafts that have been observed after storms, they can be huge. I mean, you can talk about things that are like bigger, than a football field, much bigger sometimes. They're essentially like chunks of just huge amounts of trees and other stuff washed up in the storm that are really big. So they could provide habitats. There would have been food on those rafts. There would have been fruits and flowers and bugs. It would have been like a floating little island. And so that's probably what they were. I would imagine it was by accident that these things would have been torn off the coast and went across the ocean, but you never know. Maybe it was a survival strategy in cases of extreme storms to hop on these things. Is hard to know for sure, but I think all we really know is that these improbable things did happen.
If you ran a simulation of Earth 100 times and let's assume multicellular life emerges, how many times do you think we get to vertebrates and then large mammals?
Stephen Jay Gould, in his books, he talks about this, or talked about this a lot. What would happen if we reran the tape of life? If we rewound to the 4.5 billion years ago and let the Earth unfold again, did it again and again and again. His argument was that things would be very different today in almost unpredictable ways, because the little butterfly effect, some tiny little thing, every tiny little thing would have led to ramifications over billions of years. Others, though, have argued that evolution has constraints, that we often see the same features evolved over and over again. If you're going to adapt to a certain environment, there's ways that work and ways that don't. If you're going to eat meat, you're going to want sharp teeth that look like little steak knives. If you're going to want to run fast, you want long, skinny legs, that kind of thing. So in that mindset, if you reran that tape of life, you would get something quite similar, because the same laws of gravity and laws of matter and everything apply. And evolution only has so many options. I don't really know. I don't have a firm opinion. I mean, I guess I feel that a lot of evolution is pretty contingent, just like our own lives. Little things in our own lives happen and build up over time. If we reran the tapes of our own lives, we would probably have similar outcomes sometimes, but quite different outcomes a lot of the other times. So I would think evolution would be something like that. But I certainly don't think you ever have a situation where the exact same things evolve if the tape was rerun twice.
I would say warm blood is expensive, but it unlocks things like nocturnal activity, brain power, stamina. How do you know from fossils when animals became warm-blooded?
It's a real challenge, and a lot of people have been debating this for over 50 years now. When it comes down to it, it's really hard to know if an extinct species was fully warm-blooded the way we are, meaning that they had high body temperatures that were constant regardless of the season, regardless of the time of day, and that they maintained those high constant temperatures through an internal furnace, an internal metabolic mechanism. Because after all, something could have a high constant body temperature if it just lives in Hawaii, and is out in the sun all day. But it's those three things: internal control, high body temperature, constant body temperature, that define the type of warm-blooded that we are. What we can tell from fossils often is that we can tell a lot about growth. There's growth rings in bones, like in tree trunks, that can tell us how quickly things grew. We can calculate growth rates. We can tell generally if animals were faster or slower growing. That has something to do with metabolism. We can tell from the skeletons, of animals, oftentimes how active or energetic, dynamic they might have been. But as far as as figuring out whether some things were full-on warm-blooded. Really, you need to stick a thermometer into something and see how his body temperature changes as the seasons change, as the day turns to night, and so on. We can't do that. People have devised different ways of using different chemical techniques, measuring different isotopes and elements in the bones and teeth of fossil species, things that we know in modern day animals correspond to different body temperatures. Different minerals form, different types of minerals form at different temperatures, and people have tried to use this kind of evidence, for instance. It's promising, but I think it's far from slam dunk. So there's a lot of debate about that still.
Could you tell us about Carrier's constraint, and why would wiggle locomotion develop before up and down flexion?
Yeah, I mean, it all has to do, and there's a diagram in the mammal book that shows it better than I can describe it. But basically, it has to do, so things like salamanders, lizards, fish as well move from side to side. They wiggle their bodies basically the way a snake slithers, side to side, left to right. That puts basically some pressure on the lungs. The long and short of it is that it's just harder for those animals to breathe well if they're moving fast, if they're flexing their bodies. Now, that's the primitive style of moving. Fish have it, salamanders have it, lizards have it, snakes have it. It's the base of the family tree of animals with bones that have that, and it persisted in most. But animals like mammals changed. And so mammals instead move up and down. You see a dolphin going through the water, it's up and down, it's not side to side like a snake. Same thing when you see a horse galloping or a dog running or whatever. And that just frees from this constraint, its effect on the lungs. That style of locomotion just essentially doesn't put as much pressure on the lungs. And so those animals can breathe better while moving faster.
What characteristics of fossils tell us something about animal intelligence?
Intelligence is a tricky one. I mean, it's tricky for us, and it's, of course, a really fraught question. How you compare the intelligence of different humans. And of course, people have done all kinds of terrible things over time because of perceptions about intelligence of different people or different groups of people. But, even today, I mean, you talk about all the problems people go through, standardized tests. What do standardized tests really do? Do they measure intelligence? Do they not? IQ tests. I mean, it's hard to even do it for us. To do it with fossils, with extinct animals, with things that lived millions of years ago that we can't observe is really tricky. But the one thing that we can do in some cases is we can study the brains and the senses of these fossils, mostly by using CAT scans to see inside of the skulls and building digital models of the brain, of the ears, of the sinuses, blood vessels, nerves, all of that stuff that's involved in intelligence and senses. And we can at least measure the size of the brain relative to the size of the body. We know from modern animals that generally animals that have bigger brains relative to their body are more adaptable, are better problem solvers. And so we can at least do that. And we can also see in the brains of these extinct species sometimes certain regions of the brain are large or small. So sometimes, we see really big olfactory bulbs. Those are parts of the brain that control the sense of smell. So we can infer, I think probably pretty accurately, that those types of animals had great senses of smell. The optic lobes. There's a little part of the brain at the back called the paraflocculus that helps control balance. You can see that in the CAT scan. So I think we have at least limited evidence to say that these dinosaurs were probably more intelligent than these other dinosaurs because they had bigger brains. These dinosaurs had better smell or better hearing than other dinosaurs, and we have to keep it at that level.
For a little more information on some of the things we talked about, Steve mentioned the animal that seemed most like a paleontologist might be a naked mole rat. Naked mole rats are from the Horn of Africa. Golden moles are from southern Africa, and blind mole rats are found in Eurasia. They all rely on chirps and clicks to navigate their tunnels. They find food and identify each other with these little sounds that bounce off things in the soil. And marsupial moles in Australia, which are rarely seen, were originally thought to be in the same family as African and Eurasian moles, but closer study has revealed they're a case of convergent evolution, separated from other moles and all placental mammals by at least 125 million years. The theory that primates migrated to South America on floating rafts is pretty extraordinary. Being on top of the ocean, moved by unpredictable wind, it's far from a safe strategy, and perhaps it was an accident, but rafting does open up certain hunting opportunities. Polar bears and brown bears diverged from each other about 425,000 years ago, as polar bears adapted to spend up to 6 months a year on sea ice. They evolved to their aquatic environment relatively quickly with webbed feet and incredible insulation. Sea otters and beavers also call into mind an intelligent, semi-aquatic lifestyle and an ability to shelter among tangled logs and debris. Another thing we talked about was carrier's constraint, and going back in time to the earliest version of that style of locomotion, we come to Thrinaxodon, which was a disaster species that bloomed after the Permian-Triassic extinction. Its legs were beginning to move underneath its body, more so than any previous life form. Burrows bring to my mind family groups that are huddled together, and adult Thrinaxodons have been found fossilized alongside younger individuals, which is taken as evidence of parental care. One of the real hallmarks of mammals is lactation, feeding offspring with milk, and nursing was probably a breakthrough pioneered by Morganucodon. Morganucodon developed a secondary palate at the roof of the mouth, which separated the nasal passage from the rest of the mouth. And this skeletal change is also implicated in better breathing while chewing, and is also critical for suckling, as the palate provides a surface on which the tongue can squeeze a nipple to stimulate lactation. Morganucodon had a ball and groove jaw joint, the dentary squamosal joint, which was another valuable acquisition. It made the bite more controlled and orchestrated chewing so that the bite force could be focused on particular teeth. These changes emerged at the same time as larger brains and the 6-layered neocortex, so their brains start to look a little more bulbous rather than linear. These changes, like chewing as a predigestive step and a bigger brain, more complex teeth, really set up ancestor mammals to benefit as insects diversified with the growth of flowering plants about 100 million years ago. Steve's book is filled with a bunch of great examples of little skeletal changes that enabled our mammal ancestors to survive these disasters and then radiate outwards in the absence of dinosaurs. I highly recommend his book. I really enjoyed reading it. His previous award-winning book is The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, and his latest book, The Rise and Reign of the Mammals, is available in audio and wherever you get your books. Thank you for listening.